got exciting piece of this is that Assemblymember Isaac Bryan from Southern California will be joining us about halfway through. So looking forward to having him here. He should be here around 2:45. So you'll get to hear from somebody firsthand in the legislature today. I'm Chris Martin. I'm our policy director at Housing California. And I will let you all introduce yourselves.
Cool. Going down. Hi, all. My name is Cynthia Castillo. I'm a policy advocate for Western Center on Law and Poverty. I'm not going to use the microphone. I think Marina and I have got the loud voices so you can hear us, but let us know if you can't. Western Center on Law and Poverty is a 50-year-plus organization, the largest and oldest legal support center in the state, and we focus on 3 areas of expertise, which is housing, public benefits, and health. And essentially, our whole goal is really to end poverty in California and ensure that folks have, a safe place to sleep at night, a social benefits, and a safety net. So really, really excited to be here and chat a little bit more about what the hot topics are in the legislature and what we're keeping an eye on. And I'll pass it to Marina.
Hi, I'm Marina Wyatt. I'm VP of Government Affairs with the California Housing Consortium. We are an affordable housing advocacy organization focused on production, preservation of low and moderate income housing. Work very closely with my colleagues to the left. And yes, happy to be here.
Made it sound like you're crossing the aisle there. My colleagues are crossing the aisle.
I know. I mean, that's about right.
Yeah, sure. Alrighty. Well, I think we have kind of a more interactive panel where we're going to talk kind of together instead of at you. And we have, as I mentioned, the Assembly member joining us a little bit later. But just to set some context, we are in the second year. California does 2-year legislative cycles. So we are now in the second year of a 2-year cycle. And so that means you have bills that may have not made it through the first year that are still alive and moving forward and have a shorter timeline on that front. And then you have bills that get introduced again in the second year of a cycle. So we don't have a shortage of bills at all. We have well over 150 or so around housing and homelessness this year. So there's certainly a lot on the legislature's plate this year and a lot of interest. Additionally, just a couple other things in context-wise, we also have an election this year, so that's certainly impacting the political landscape in the building. We have a budget surplus. Depending on who you talk to, you'll get a different number, but I would say we're about close to $30 billion for some folks. So similar to last year, we had a significant budget surplus, so there's a lot of work being done in the budget this year, and I think we'll talk at length about that. And then one of the biggest things is there are a lot of folks that are leaving the legislature. So there's kind of this weird dynamic where we have a lot of vacancies. There was actually an election today, I believe, for Autumn Burke's seat. And so there is a lot of empty seats, which causes some challenges in terms of getting votes. A lot of progressive Democrats are out that left the legislature for other positions. And so that kind of leaves us short votes in a lot of places. So with all of that context, I'll pose the question of how that has created challenges and opportunities for us this year.
I'll just talk a little bit maybe around the vacancies. So, this has been typically the second year of a 2-year cycle because of the election season. Can sometimes be a lot more difficult to push really challenging or controversial legislation. I think what is unique this year, and we'll see how that ends up shaking out, is because of all those vacancies, we're going to have a very new, young legislature next year. So it's going to be, at least 20 new people in the assembly out of 80, right? And we have also still several members that are going to be terming out. We're going to likely see the speaker change over happen next session. So I think it creates this opportunity of in spite of this being an election year, we actually might be able to get perhaps more controversial things done, or could maybe get more controversial things passed this year because that turnover is happening. And I think there's a little bit of perhaps fear from us of the kind of chaos that might happen next year when you have such a young legislature that like doesn't really know anything and are going to be afraid of their shadow.
Right, and I mean, even adding just like in the housing policy context, everyone wants to work on housing, right? But do they really get the issues? There's so many crises. I think I mentioned this in my panel this morning, but we call it the housing crisis, but it's really an affordable housing crisis. It's a homelessness crisis. It's a moderate and mid-income housing crisis. It's all of those things happening at the same time. And whether it's going to be interesting to see whether these legislators have the experience and sort of digging into the issues about what we can do to really kind of turn the tide on some of these issues. We also have, like Marina said, so much money in our coffers right now. So, how are we going to be able to play with that and ensure that they are really prioritizing housing and homelessness issues? Will be very interesting to kind of see how that plays out. So definitely something to be thinking about.
I think one of the challenges, I will say, continues to be that we've kind of done all of the things that are easy to do, right, to address the housing crisis, to address the homelessness crisis. And so to really make an impact at this point is going to have to be something significant. And we'll touch on some of like potential bills or funding opportunities around that, but all of those things are going to be that much more difficult to get done. And as Chris said, with these vacancies, harder to get to your 41 votes or your 54 votes in the assembly.
Yeah, and I mean, like, to that point, it really impacts 2/3 vote bills, because in the past you have kind of like your guaranteed votes on some super progressive legislation, and then you kind of got to sway these moderate Democrats. And when you have vacancies, you don't have those people to sway, and so it makes a 2/3 vote bill like almost impossible in some respects. And then, like, to Cynthia's point about the budget surplus, I just think what's interesting now with these two budget surpluses is looking at last year, we talked about this morning, is that we finally started to see the state invest in a multi-year manner, right? We even using the Home Key program as an example, they invested last year in a 2-year allocation into that program in a significant way. We're talking, I like to joke, we're using the letter B now instead of the letter M, referencing billions instead of millions, and like kind of going to the scale larger than even the federal government does in a lot of respects. And so I think these budget surpluses allow us both the opportunity to start thinking about scale and start thinking about how we can do this in a multi-year fashion instead of these kind of 1 year, every year we have to keep coming back for more, and can start thinking more sustainably and in a long-term way. So that's kind of one of the opportunities that I could see.
Definitely an opportunity, and it's taken decades of inaction for us to get here, to get to the point where Gavin Newsom is saying, look, we are going to make housing and homelessness the cornerstone of my administration, right? And then here comes COVID. And I think that's another aspect that we need to be thinking about, is that the legislature has really kind of taken the stance, essentially, that COVID is over. It may be for people that are above income people, but for low-income Californians, they are feeling that now. They are feeling the lost wages. They have accrued debt over the past 2 years. And I think I'll go into this a little bit further, but particularly something that is really concerning is that we may see a mass amount of evictions very, very soon, because protections that were related to your inability to pay rent because of COVID have ended. And so are these legislators going to come in and take the viewpoint that, COVID is over and that low-income people have already moved on and that they don't need extra assistance? The past 2 years have been a slew of emergency proposals that have just been slowly being taken off the books. So will there be political courage to say that the issue just doesn't end because a mask mandate has been lifted? I think that's something that Western Center is really, really interested in seeing play out, because for us, we know that low-income Californians are definitely still feeling the effects of the pandemic and are, still struggling. So more on that later.
Anything you want to add?
I guess the last thing I'll add on this sort of high-level thing, especially on COVID, is COVID really changed the way we all do our jobs, right? Like how we've all had to change and evolve, and our job in the Capitol has been really challenging the last 2 years. I think I don't know if it was here. Maybe it was here a couple of years ago, or virtually, I think, where I talked about this. Like, we work for nonprofits. We don't represent high money interests, right? And our access to the legislature, it has always been sort of boots on the ground, people in the building, walking the halls. And when COVID shut down that, and it became everything was done via email, via phone, via Zoom, like while in some ways there was sort of more access, I think, for some people that maybe aren't local and that more people can participate in hearings than perhaps before. I think the access has actually gone drastically down because you can't, for us, like we want to talk to a member, we want to talk to staff and put some pressure on them to find out how they're going to vote on a bill that we care about. And we would just like sit and wait in their office until they would meet with us. We can't do that, right? You just like keep emailing and it's like this black box of like, hey, can I meet with you? Hey, can I meet with you? No response. And so it's been a real game changer, I think, for how do you operate in a sort of lobbying world like that. And then the folks who represent people who have more access, direct access, I think it increased their power, unfortunately. Typically for the issues we care about, right?
Yeah, which is our kind of like our second piece here on COVID. The one thing I wanted to talk about, thinking through what COVID has both taught us and also exposed for us. One thing that has struck me over the last few years is just like, I think people lose faith in that we can actually accomplish something. But over the last 2 years, this governor, right when COVID started, created Project Room Key, right? And immediately put resources into protecting and sheltering unhoused people that, who are extremely vulnerable to COVID-19. And they housed, I think the latest number was like over 50,000 people in like 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years. Like that in and of itself is an example of how if we put intention, we put efforts, and we back that up with resources, we can do this. We can actually accomplish a lot, and then looking at Home Key and the way that the HCD stood up that program and got those resources out, and jurisdictions came to the table to make that program work and move in such a rapid pace. It just shows that intentionality really does achieve results. And to me, that's one thing that I take away from hopefully the end of this eventually, is that it restored kind of the faith that we're here for something that we can do, we can accomplish and achieve that hopefully in the near future.
And I'll add to that. Western Center for years has been telling the legislature that if you give poor people money, that they will be better off. Just give them money, right? And the idea of universal basic income seemed like something that was an impossibility years ago. And now we're seeing so much time and effort and really supporting it, because for the past 2 years, when the governor and the federal government decided to actually give individuals funding so that they could use it towards their expenses, so many more people were lifted out of poverty. We have the numbers. It's amazing. And I can say personally, when I got that extra check, you were able to use it on, what a godsend. So I think for us, it's been really interesting to see how just the climate changing so quickly within the past 2 years allowed the legislature to have the political will to say, look, we need to fund this cash, give folks some money, and then they will use it for the things and the services that they need.
And building on that, I saw something recently. I'm not going to get quoted perfectly, but there was a pilot done in Santa Clara County by Destination Home, who provided, similar to the ERAP program, where they provided resources for people to remain stably housed. And this last year, they saw their first time newly homeless numbers go down, which is a perfect example of how we can provide housing stability resources, and it will impact our that inflow into homelessness. And when you combine that with resources to get people out of homelessness, you can really start to achieve results. And I think we saw that by starting to take this approach of providing housing stability and resources for folks. Anything you want to add on COVID?
I don't have anything to add.
Alrighty. Well, our next one is legislation. What are you hoping to accomplish this year in the second year of a cycle? And just to set a timing context, we are in, I just realized it was April recently, and we are pretty far along in about a quarter of the way, I would say, through, about a quarter to a third of the way through this year, meaning bills are being heard in policy committee. There was a housing committee hearing yesterday. There was more committee hearings on Monday. I think there's plenty today. So a lot is going on right now, and so things are going through their policy committees, and so I think the deadline is the end of April, like the late 27, 28, 29, somewhere in that area, to get out of policy committee and onto appropriations in the floor. But just to set some timing context as to where we're at in the legislative session.
Yeah, and so, Chris talked about how we're tracking like 150 bills. Hopefully by the end of April, that will be like 50 bills. Fingers
Hopefully.
crossed. You want me to talk about my sponsored bills?
Yeah.
So we are, the last couple years have been challenging to really, as we've touched on, make some really meaningful progress on more controversial bills for a variety of reasons. And so this year we really tried to come into the year being like, let's focus on budget. We have a lot of great budget opportunities. I think we'll touch on our budget priorities later, but like, let's focus on budget and let's focus on like easier bills. Like, let's do some, like, how can we kind of make the affordable housing finance system work better? And how can we sort of increase production of affordable housing, but without touching like a lot of the third rail issues? So for us, like we have two sponsored bills this year. The first bill is AB 2334 by Assemblymember Wicks. So 2, 3, 4 years ago, we sponsored a bill with Assemblymember Chu that was AB 1763. And that was a bill that created the enhanced density bonus for 100% affordable projects. And what that gave was an 80% density bonus for for any affordable housing project, and then for projects that were within a half mile of a major transit stop, they had no limits on density up to 3 additional stories. And so building on the work of that bill, we introduced, Assemblymember Wicks introduced 2334, which expands the eligibility of what projects, the area of the projects that qualify for that unlimited density from just being projects within half mile of transit to any project in a low VMT area. And so to be low VMT, it means that that area has 15% below the regional vehicle mile traveled, meaning it is location efficient, it is close to jobs, it's close to, there is transportation, there might not be sort of at the highest level of high quality, but there's connectivity. And that's exactly the type of infill development that we want to be promoting, when all the studies show that when you have lower income households living in those communities, there's better health outcomes, there's better GHG reduction benefits. And so we were really excited to move that bill forward this year, and we did get it out of Assembly Housing Committee last week. Yay. Thank you to Assemblymember Ward in the back for his vote on that bill. And so we're really excited to see how to have that progress through the process this year.
And Marina, can I make a comment on this? So maybe we don't have to go through all the bills. But one thing I find really interesting and exciting is that the governor in his January budget proposal said, like, housing can be a environmental a solution. So how do we mix those two areas together so that when we're building, we're thinking about the environment and building smart? And that's what I love about bills like that, when we're talking about lowering VMT and lowering your GHG emissions. It's exciting because it's a nexus that I think a lot of Californians have always sort of craved. I know before I worked in housing policy, I worked in water and environmental policy. And so I think that the nexus there is huge. And the governor sort of saying that in the January budget proposal, and then bills such as Marina's that really kind of tie those two issues together I believe are really sort of the bills that I think most Californians really are excited about, right? And we're not in our silos. We can't be thinking about silos anymore. We kind of need to break down those barriers and make sure that our housing is energy efficient, environmentally friendly. I think it's sort of what we're all kind of craving.
Yeah, housing as a climate strategy.
There we go. That's the
brand.
Yeah. And then, like, sort of in keeping with our goals to kind of make the affordable housing finance system more efficient, easier to navigate, we are sponsoring a bill with CHPC that is AB 2006. Yes. It's always weird. Do I say 2006 or do I say 2006? Anyway, it would streamline the compliance monitoring on the back end of the project. If a project's receiving funding from multiple state agencies, it would direct the agencies to put together an MOU by the beginning of 2024 so that there wouldn't be any duplicate work being done, and just really trying to, like, why should we have physical inspections from 2 state entities instead of just one? And so, I think that one actually passed out a committee this week on consent. So real great. Hopefully that has a nice smooth path. And there's a lot of other bills that we're not sponsoring that are similar to that are trying to make the system work more efficiently, simpler, save money. So like another bill that is out there is by Senator Becker, that's SB 948, and similarly it would allow pooled transition reserves at HCD. So, right now, if you're doing PSH project, you have to have your transition reserve. Why does everyone need to have a transition reserve when you rarely have to use the transition reserve? So can we instead pool it and treat it more like an insurance program? And so, another kind of simple bill, but common sense bill to try to make these things more efficient. And on that same top, sorry, go ahead.
I have a comment about simple bill. And what I love about being on a panel with Marina is that for folks that aren't like in the day-to-day, I'm like, simple bill, that sounded really complicated. I think, in terms of just like lowering barriers and making, creating housing, I love that your organization is really focused and in the weeds, right? It's really technical. There are so many barriers just in terms of when you want to build something that we don't even quite realize that a regular day person would have no idea that, this small tweak would have is basically an elegant solution to ensuring that we build more housing. And so that's why I'm like, I love that it's simple for you. And, because it's a small step, but has a huge impact. So I just wanted to
it's true. I mean, it is for the developers and local government who are part of these deals. It's crazy what you guys do, and I feel like every year, I've been doing this for 10 years. Every year I learn so much more, and it still feels like I'm just scraping the surface on housing development. I was talking to one of our members who's an attorney for the investor side of a deal, and I was like, this was yesterday, and I'm like, how many people are part of a closing? And it was like, like 35. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And I'm like, you guys all sit in a room together and like sign a stack of papers? And she's like, no, we don't do that anymore. I'm like, oh, okay. But what about those closing it's like, again, you just scratch the surface. 35 people signing a document. Anyway, I'll pass it on to maybe Cynthia, if you want to talk about some of your top priorities.
I'll highlight some people-centered ones, and then we could kind of bop around. So one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up first is that, the low-income individuals have not been able to pay their rent for the past 2 years, and the legislature had to extend eviction protections several times over the past 2 years. The protections for being unable to pay your rent ended for the most part this past September, but there was a special court processes created so that individuals wouldn't just be, evicted en masse. And really all of those protections were tied to whether you applied to the statewide rental assistance program, ERAP. And, Western Center, a lot of tenant organizations, a lot of folks have been fighting tooth and nail because we're concerned, highly concerned that the rate of funds going into people's pockets has been way too slow. And so we're grateful that the legislature extended those special eviction protections until June, another 3 months. But the concern that there still is, I think, for a lot of people on the ground, and which I think, to me, I'll say this, I think this is the hot topic, is that if you were unable to apply based on language barriers, we know that the application process was lengthy initially. It was cut down from 30 pages down to 10 at midway point. If those individuals have not applied for rental assistance and the deadline was by March 30th, they are no longer protected from eviction, and there's also a 3-month preemption that was extended with the court protections, meaning that local jurisdictions that may have had stronger protections can no longer implement those protections for another 3 months. And so what that means is that there are folks that may have not gotten in the portal in time that are looking at are facing eviction right now. So I think something that we're grateful for is that the legislature has worked with us to understand the importance of keeping folks stably housed, but we're concerned that the proposal fell short and that we're going to see, you know, a lot of evictions coming in the next coming months. So if you know someone that works at legal aid, support them. They're going through a lot right now and trying to make sure that people get the assistance that they need. If you are a tenant that did apply and haven't gotten those funds, we are working really closely with HCD to make sure that you are getting those funds a lot quicker. Initially, people were waiting up to 3 months to even get a response whether their application was acceptable. So 3 months is way too long to think about whether you're going to get that necessary funding. And as we all know, housing is absolutely key to every other aspect of your life. You know, I think we can talk about this, but the state generally has a housing first model, which is the understanding that an individual needs housing and that safety before they can meaningfully deal with other issues in their life, whether that mean getting assistance for, you know, behavioral health services, et cetera. And so I think that's just something that I'd be remiss if not to mention, that we're keeping a really close eye on seeing whether we're gonna see a large slew of evictions, hopefully not. And if we can avoid that, that'd be fantastic. So just something that I would like to highlight.
Did you already touch on how much money has gone out of the requests? Did you say that at the beginning?
I believe it was a third. So of all the folks that have applied, about a third has gone out, which is woefully under what we need. So it's hard not to get a little bit emotional about this. This is, I think legislators are taking this seriously, but due to bureaucratic hurdles, people have not gotten the money that they've needed. So I think it's something that is super important that we keep an eye on. I have the notes here, Marina. Thank you, because I'm so bad at remembering stats. Thank you, Jade. Also, there's one printer in the building, and she helped me print out the stats for me. So. Only 16% of applicants have received money, largely due to bureaucratic delays.
16%.
Yeah. 488,000 California renter households have applied, and more than 180,000 of them had been approved, but fewer than 76,000 have actually received payments. So these are just stats that can be pretty disheartening. But what we have now are court protections in place for the next 3 months that we're excited to see. And we'll continue to work with the legislature to see, after the 3 months, whether more support is needed. We asked for more funding from the federal government for the rental assistance program, and perhaps we'll see more funding at later rounds. But I think it's not just California, but across the United States, there are a lot of people that are still struggling with that. So I will move on from that one just to another bill, and I really appreciate you guys letting me get emotional there for a second, because this stuff is important. So we're also running another bill, 2713 by Wicks. So a couple years ago, California passed AB 1482, which prohibited rent gouging and established just cause eviction protections. It was hugely groundbreaking of a bill. But what we found, you know, hearing from legal aid individuals across the state, is that there were actually a couple of loopholes, essentially, in terms of how we wanted the bill to be enforced. And so there were 3 circumstances where a landlord would be able to evict a tenant. So the first would be if the owner, the landlord, or a close family member was going to move into the unit as a primary residence, right? So that makes sense. You're a landlord. Oops, I lost my other house. I have this unit. You're gonna have to evict your tenant so that you can move in. The second is that the owner would be doing substantial renovations that would require the tenant to be out of the home. And then the third would be that the owner is exiting the rental market. So those were, 3 circumstances that under 1482, a tenant could be evicted or displaced. But what we found is that across the state, that it was essentially being used as a pretext to evict tenants and then go around and then put the rental unit back on the market and at a higher price. And so obviously that is not the intent of 1482, and absolutely adds to the intense housing crisis, right? If we're continuing to lift the prices and make them unattainable for low-income Californians, and those low-income Californians are displaced, right? Where do they go from there? So essentially, 2713 by Wix. Shout out to my colleague Tina Rosales, who is the lead on this. So if I get any burning questions that I can't answer, I will send those to Tina. This 2713 would tighten the language around no-fault evictions to ensure that these provisions are utilized the way that they were intended to. So a huge bill for us. We see it as cleanup, but we do have some challenges getting it through. And just wanted to highlight that one before I can maybe pass it to Chris for some of his, and we can.
Sure. Yeah. And luckily, we have Assembly Member Brian later to talk about two of our sponsored bills, so I can let him, because he's going to more eloquently talk about them than I probably ever could. But I'll highlight a couple, two funding bills. One is AB 2817. This is a bill I was really excited to see get introduced. This actually was just amended, I believe, like 5 days ago from Majority Leader Reyes. And this bill is really looking at how, when we talk about housing and homelessness, we have to do it through kind of a dual lens, right? We have to also develop new capital. We need more units. We need to build up our housing stock. But at the same time, we have unhoused people on the streets today. And we need to address that immediately. We need to do something to provide folks resources to get off the streets. And we've seen a model play out in quite a few cities, starting with Los Angeles, called the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, which essentially provides rental assistance to get people into housing at whatever cost. Getting them into either a private market unit, maybe drawing down an affordable unit and making it more targeted towards somebody that is experiencing homelessness, really doing whatever is necessary to get somebody a unit today. And so this bill is creating essentially a flexible housing subsidy pool for the state. And it would provide direct rental assistance to people throughout the state to get into housing. It also includes things, what I call housing-based services, which is like landlord incentives, housing navigation services, and things that get people into housing and help identify units. And this bill is got a budget request to it I'll talk about later, which is $5 billion. And one of the exciting things about this bill is it actually sets a goal, right? We talk about our bills and we talk about, what we're trying to do, but we never always set a goal of people impacted, which the roadmap does, and I could get into that later. But there is a goal within this bill to house at least 50,000 people. So that would be unprecedented in our state's response to homelessness in a permanent way, not in a short interim way, in a permanent way. It would get people into permanent housing for 5 years at least, and it would house at least 50,000 people. I'm confident if people get creative and find other options, we could go well beyond 50,000 and kind of show how we can do this, as I mentioned earlier, how we could house people quickly. The other one is also a funding bill that I'm also really excited to talk about. I think all of our organizations are incredibly supportive of this, which Assemblywoman Wicks introduced. I think it's going to be author-sponsored, right?
I think it's author-sponsored.
Yeah, it's probably author-sponsored, but we are all strongly supportive of. This kind of takes the approach we do with education, where we set a minimum threshold of what we need to invest in the state to provide resources for education. This does the same thing for housing. It says, essentially that housing is a basic need, and we should set a bare minimum funding level in our state budget. Instead of letting that fluctuate each year and change, we set a consistent level of a base of which we would be investing, and that would be 5%. And that would go towards homelessness resources, preventing and ending homelessness, building new housing and capital, and also home ownership opportunities. And one of the other cool things about it is that it includes a 10-year investment strategy, and the state would have to actually think through how they're going to utilize these resources in a strategic way to achieve results, which is similar to the roadmap in the sense that we're kind of having that long-term vision. And two of our other bills, Marina already talked about in
I want to talk, just interject real quick on ACA 14. So I think this is a good example of sort of how the scale has changed over the last 10 years, especially, right? When we worked, Housing California and CHC worked for 5 years to try to pass the document recording fee, the permanent source of funding for affordable housing. And it took 5 years, and it got us $300 million a year-ish. And at the time, we also kept talking about like, oh, we need $1 billion. We need to replace the $1 billion that we lost from redevelopment, and like what we got was $300 million. And so this is just huge in the sense that like we're talking now about $10 billion a year. And while probably the prospects of getting this through the legislature and on the ballot and is low, it is a huge symbol of like how much this has changed and the scale of the need and the kind of resources that key members of the legislature are out front saying need to be put towards addressing housing. I mean, even if we got a fraction of that 10 billion, it would be huge, right? Like if we got $1 billion a year for production on an ongoing basis, that would be huge for starting to close that gap. And so just, you know, it's a wild time to like the evolution of sort of the work that we've done over the last 10 years. The crisis has probably gotten bigger, but unfortunately, but just the scale has shifted so much.
Right, and an ongoing funding stream, I think Marina said that so eloquently about how important it is, but I used to work in higher education policy and thinking about how we fund education, right? There is a piece of the budget that always is dedicated to education, and I think it's really past due time where we start thinking about housing, because really what it is a basic need, the basic need, and essentially the state kind of going into that role and thinking about it that way and funding it accordingly, I think will be extremely important.
You want to hit 27?
Yeah. So in terms of other things that are hot topics, another, it's not a bill that we're sponsoring, but I really want to highlight some of the movement in the grassroots and sort of the housing world, is this idea about tenant opportunity to Purchase Act or Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA or COPA campaigns. So across the state, there are been propped up local ordinances that allow for a tenant or an eligible nonprofit, mission-driven nonprofits, to have the first opportunity to purchase a house or a unit when the owner decides to sell the property. Currently, there are so many homes on the private market that are accessible to low-income households. But it's decreasing faster than we can build affordable housing, and they are being just propped up by the Blackstones of the world and resold at a higher price. And so these local ordinances have sort of made way to a statewide bill, AB 2710, by CALRA, which would essentially make a statewide a bill to allow for tenants and mission-driven nonprofits to purchase the property and really remove it from the speculative market, which we know is sort of what has been fueling a lot of the issues, the homelessness that we're seeing across the state. It is so difficult to attain a home, even if you are moderate income. Imagine how difficult it is if you are struggling and you are low income or you are unhoused. It feels almost nearly impossible. So this is one way to level the playing field, and there are many. I hope in the mingling you've met with Jack back there, Andres, Ramos. There's a lot of cool people that are working on this policy, as well as folks that are really driving this. I would say also the community land trusts across the state, which would be a mission-driven nonprofit that would utilize this bill to acquire those property and make them affordable in perpetuity, which is exactly what I think all of us here would find to be the best option there to ensure that people can stay stably housed. So really, really excited about 2710. And it's going to be a challenging bill, but I believe it's up in the next couple weeks. So all of these bills that we're shooting at you, rapid fire, I'm sure maybe there'll be a leave behind. And if not, you could connect with us afterwards to see if there's ways that you can get involved, to call in, to hearings, send in your support and opposition on letters to the legislature so that they can hear your voices on some of these topics. So.
I think this would be a good time to also mention Assemblymember Ward's bill, AB 1771, that is also kind of going at the same challenge around speculation. I don't know do you want to talk about your bill yourself?
Yes!
Yeah. So Assemblymember will explain it, but also going after the speculative market and trying to deal with these the investors trying to flip these flip properties and driving up the cost of housing. But
Thank you, Summer.
Thank
for
you.
the impromptu.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Just a short couple steps from the Capitol. You picked a great week to come up here. There's so much activity happening. Of course, we had our Housing Community Development Committee just yesterday. Really lucky to be a member appointed to that committee. We got a great chair in Buffy Wicks and just a really strong complement of members as well. And congratulations on coming back up. We're really happy to have the public visiting us, advocating, coming together, here at the Convention Center as well around the Capitol community. Chris Ward, representing the 78th Assembly District, which is urban San Diego and a lot of our coastal communities in the San Diego region. Previously worked on San Diego City Council and served as the chair of our Land Use and Housing Committee, as well as the chair of our Regional Task Force on the Homeless, our COC, for the County of San Diego, and just poured myself into housing and homelessness related policies and solutions here, and it's a really good time, I think, to be working on these issues. We've got, if last year was any indication, there's a ton of political will to say yes, to do bigger and bolder things, to work with all of our partners to push even higher, because the conditions are so dire. Thank you as advocates for the work that you do, helping individuals find their home, secure their home, stay in their home, be able to work on rental assistance. I mean, the complement of issues that are out there right now that we share with you and we take so seriously to be able to move things forward. We're not at 100% yet. We've got a lot more work to do, and not everything for one reason or another makes it all the way to the governor's desk. But we're not deterred from any of those setbacks. We're going to double down, and we're going to have an even harder year this year to work on some of these solutions. Appreciate that you brought up the bill. One of my biggest lifts is working on speculation. As we've seen our housing prices rise, not 2%, not 5%, but 20% in a single year statewide, 26% in the county of San Diego. It is mind-boggling what is going on here, and we know that from some of that own industry data that the incidence of investor buyers or speculators that are coming in there, layering on top of our already horrible supply challenges, is compounding and distorting the market and making it so much harder for the next homeowner to even get into the first place. That raises the price of already expensive housing. That raises the price of middle income housing, which raises the price of lower income housing. And in particular, those that are going after middle and lower income units and really holding those on means that they're holding them away from an eventual California homeowner to be able to secure those units. So it's a heavy lift. We're working on that bill. What the bill does is actually imposes a tax penalty on short-term sales and flips of many of these transactions, because we know what they're in for. They're in for the money. They're in for that short-term gain to try to get that 20% profit on a very stable asset. These are assets. They're assets for homeowners, not for real estate speculators. So we're working on some big ticket issues. I'm proud to work with a lot of our community partners on community college opportunities for students and faculty to be able to work with a lot of our cities so that they are properly using some of their municipal tax exempt bonds so they can actually deliver on middle income housing that's sponsored by the Housing Consortium. So we've got, just a range of legislators and community advocates, but I'll just, leave you with a thank you and leave you with an ask that you be loud, that you keep doing the work that you're doing, because we cannot sometimes get those votes necessary unless constituents are speaking up, unless you're activating a lot of the people who are affected, your renters, your homeowners, your clients. We need to hear those voices up here. It's as simple as a phone call, simple as an email, or pushing on a button, and I really encourage you to continue to use your organizations and your spirit of advocacy to be able to do more. Thank you again for coming up here. Thank you for a little bit of time to say hello to everybody. I'll be around in the back if anybody has any specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Assembly Member. One thing I reflected on previously is it's really refreshing to have a member that is so committed to this. Marina was talking about access earlier. I think when Assembly Member Ward came in, his staff and him are just so committed that they come to us and talk to us. They hear what our thoughts. We hear from you guys and go to them. And he actually takes that into account and puts it into his bills, as opposed to a lot of members where it's like, oh, nice, thanks, I appreciate your advocacy, have a nice day. And so I just want to appreciate that, because he's been committed since his time in City Council, where I got to know him well there. So strong appreciation there. Other bills we want to highlight?
How do we follow that?
I know, right? Can we just call it now? Are we just done?
Well, why don't I touch on another hot topic, which is How many of you guys were paying attention to this UC Berkeley enrollment crisis? And yeah, big topic, right? Legislature acted very quickly to modify CEQA to make it so that those enrollment numbers don't trigger a CEQA challenge. I think, and we've seen there's new legislation. Senator Wiener has a bill, SB 886, that would exempt public university housing from CEQA. I think this just highlights again what Chris touched on earlier. When the legislature wants to do something, they can and will do it. And what is the right kind of pressure to get them to do that action? Like that bill, they did like overnight. They tweaked CEQA to deal with this UC Berkeley enrollment issue. Not a single no vote. So how do we, and so I think the question that we're always struggling with is how do we harness that? How do we make housing the thing that has that same reaction? Someone said something really, there was an op-ed after that happened and I don't remember the quote, but it was like it's nice to know that those kids get to go there and not be able to ever afford a house after they finish their education. It was like some kind of funny, like quirky little comment like that. But, and so I think again, like every year we see this like slew of CEQA bills. And, again, it'll be interesting to see like what else can be done on around that in this year or maybe in the future.
Right. And
Maria,
yeah.
just real quick, what did Labor have to say about it, if anything?
So they all stayed out of that one. Yeah. That one, I will say, like, the bill that passed was sort of minor in the sense that, like enrollment has to be enrollment numbers are part of the EIR, and so a change in enrollment would trigger the thing. So I think because it wasn't fully exempt, it wasn't actually exempting anything, it was just kind of tweaking what is a component of an EIR. But Labor is supportive of Senator Wiener's bill because his CEQA exemption for student housing has a skilled and trained workforce requirement.
And I'll note a little bit on this. So Western Center is supportive of CEQA, and for a couple of reasons. We always see these slew of bills related to CEQA, but our concern obviously, is that low-income individuals would be, we'd create or build in toxic sites, which we know has historically happened. Low-income people of color have, in terms of land use planning, have, for the most part, been relegated to unhealthy or undesirable parts of town. And that's a historic harm that Western Center looks to undo. And so it's a very interesting conversation to have about CEQA because there are times where, even we realize that there needs to be some buildings built by right. And to bypass some exemptions. But CEQA to us is an incredibly important tool. And we just don't want to lose sight of the fact that there are some environmental factors that, of course, would impact people of color and low-income people of color the most. So I just want to make that comment, too.
Well, and I think you raise an important distinction, I'd say, though, Cynthia, in that the way you think about CEQA is the way it was intended to be used, right? And to protect people and to protect the environment. And it's sort of, I think that's, unfortunately, the route has been to create these mass exemptions for certain types of specialty projects, instead of really going in and perhaps raising some of the legal standards or tweaking the law in a way that really allows the true CEQA lawsuits to continue, but really trying to pull away the abuses that are where people are weaponizing CEQA to block good housing.
And I think this might be also another conversation about co-opting in the housing space, right? Co-opting, maybe you'll co-opt CEQA to block an affordable housing project, or maybe you will co-opt racial equity, and for your NIMBYism. So I think, there's also a lot of that, I think, in the policy work that we do. And it's hard to parse out the difference. I think your everyday Californian might not know that there's a lot of nuances in how you use CEQA or why you use certain excuses. So absolutely something we're keeping an eye on too, is, as Western Center focuses on racial and economic justice, that our mission isn't co-opted to then go ahead and create barriers for our own clients, which we see all the time. I can tell you so many times I've read a fact sheet that says that it assists and helps low-income people of color, and I'm reading it like, no, it doesn't. So I think there's a lot to be said there about whether we really are thinking about low-income people of color, or if it's just a talking point in order to get your bill signed.
My favorite is when the NIMBYs come in to oppose legislation, and their frequent talking point is, this does nothing for affordable housing. And I'm like, you are the same person that doesn't want affordable housing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, before we jump to budget, I do want to highlight one more bill. I don't know if you guys have any others you want to highlight before we go to budget. But I'm gonna highlight 1961. This is a bill we're really excited about, and just to kind of add a little bit on the process with this bill. Housing California has the Residents United Network, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. It's a group of residents who meet to talk about legislation and how they can activate and pass policies. And so they go through a process called There Ought to Be a Law. And it happens every year, usually in the late summer, early fall. We start thinking about what should be a law in California to help people access affordable housing and end homelessness. And this bill came out of that process. It was actually generated from RUN, authentically from day one. And so this bill is AB 1961. It deals with kind of how you find and apply for housing. And this would create a new statewide affordable housing database where tenants or people that are looking for affordable housing can go to and access easily. Obviously, it can be a challenge for people to locate and find and apply for affordable housing. And so this would create kind of one centralized area in which people could go, find affordable housing in their area, and hopefully apply for it and access it. And so we're really excited about this bill. It's authored by Assemblymember Gabriel. It is likely to be heard later this month, either the 20th or the 27th in Housing Committee. But just wanted to highlight that one before we move on.
I have a couple other that I can
Go for it.
So another bill that this was a reintroduction of a bill from last year is AB 1911 by Assemblymember Gabriel. This one is a cool one. It would create a capital gains tax credit to encourage an at-risk a property that's at risk of conversion for that owner to sell to a preservation purchaser. So if you're gonna, we can't compel private owners to sell property and keep it affordable. They're allowed, once their deed restrictions expire, they can do what they want to do with it. And this would give them a capital gains credit on their capital gains that would hopefully make them want to sell to, the Pacific companies or another, affordable developer that's out here. So I think it's a cool bill. I think it's clever. I think the challenge with that one tends to be a budget. There's a cost to it, and like all things, the legislature has to evaluate where do they want to prioritize their spending, which we will also talk about in the budget. And then the other thing I just want to talk about, which also is related to budget, is, as always, there's a huge emphasis on homeownership this year. And I think we kind of struggle a little bit with it because home ownership is an important component along the spectrum of housing. And I think, we would like to continue to see people want to see everything, to prioritize both home ownership opportunities and also funding for deed-restricted affordable housing. And so that's just the one other thing, the nuance that's out there is, and again, going to Chris's early comments about the scale, we've often lived in this world in our budget priorities that it was like we only have X dollars, and how do we allocate that limited amount of dollars? And I think we now live in this universe where we can say it's both and. Mm-hmm. I don't have to give, I'm asking for $5 billion for the MHP program. That doesn't mean we can't also do $1 billion for down payment assistance. That's been a big shift. Is we want to make sure that everything continues to be this both and. Anyway, those are my two things.
Anything else
Not
for
the
you?
most eloquent.
No,
I've
that
ever
was
been.
incredibly eloquent. Both and will be the slogan.
I stole that from Lisa Hershey.
There you go.
This is true. All right, shall we move to budget?
Yep.
Alrighty. Well, I guess I just am curious what you all are seeing themes-wise in the budget this year. The governor, of course, released his budget on, I think it was on Jan 10 this year, right? Or was it
On
Jan
time,
9?
yeah, on the day, on a
On the
Monday.
day, yeah. He has to release an initial budget on Jan 10. It's called the Jan 10 budget, really creative name. And then it's just kind of the initial discussion around what he's proposing. Then the legislature works on hearing that budget, so to say. And then they start to form the legislature's budget. And there's the May revise, which is coming in 4 weeks. Wow, we're moving along fast. And then the legislature has to pass a budget by June 15th. So that's the context. I'm curious what you all are prioritizing or seeing and moving in the budget.
Yeah, I mean, we were really excited to see the governor's budget. There's a lot of great stuff in there, a lot of things funding priorities that we care about. Continued the additional $500 million to the state tax credit program, really supportive of that. Additional money to the ASIC program, additional money to this portfolio reinvestment program to rehab older HCD projects. All real big priorities for us. I think the one piece that was missing on the housing production side, in our opinion, was additional dollars to the MHP program and to the accelerator program. Together with Housing California, we were co-leads of the Prop 1 housing bond, Veterans and Affordable Housing Bond, whatever it was called back then.
I think, yeah.
Most of that money is gone, right? I'm sure that, I see a lot of nods, the development community is seeing. We have a NOFA, the Super NOFA was just released on Friday from HCD. We have one more Super NOFA supposedly next year. There's like $200 million in MHP after this NOFA. We really need to reinvest and take a lot of this surplus. We're not having another housing bond in November. And so let's pre-fund MHP for the next 3 years, 5 years while we have this gray budget surplus. And so we've been doing a lot of advocacy with the Senate and the Assembly and the governor's office. And I think it's very possible that we will be successful in getting some, I don't know how much, the scale of the money, but I think we will be successful in getting some additional dollars into the MHP program this year.
Can you talk about the 50%, the federal 50% test and all that fun stuff, and how that impacts this?
Yeah, so, the 4% tax credit program, which utilizes taxes and bonds, the bond program has been oversubscribed now for the last 2 years. We've been dealing with chaos. Probably you all know the kind of chaos that we've been dealing with. CHPC helps staff and lead the TCAC CIDLAC working group, where we've been spending brain numbing hours trying to provide some advice on how to fix the regs to deal with some of these challenges. And we were really hopeful that with the Build Back Better, with the federal government would lower the 50% test to 25%, thereby doubling the amount of units that we could produce using the 4% credit. And unfortunately, not going to happen. I don't know how many of you been to any of the federal panels where they talk about how it's not going to happen. I think part of the governor's January budget, was built around the idea that we might have gotten that. And so that's, I think, why some of the funding choices were what they were. And now that we are past that point, I think that will make a big impact. But so part of our advocacy, in addition to MHP, is additional dollars to the accelerator program so that we can keep moving out these projects. And one of the things we've thought about for years is how do we actually increase production beyond the limits of the tax credit program. And I've talked about this a lot with our members. We live in this closed universe. Even if we made the program as efficient as possible, right? It's still at most 25,000 units a year. And so it's always, I think the accelerator actually created, or the oversubscription of the bonds created an interesting opportunity to come up with a way to build outside of the tax credit system. And if things continue this way, where we have that amount of investment, where we can go beyond what the tax credit system kind of universe provides, I think it's a real opportunity to figure out like what are the right types of projects to be funded outside of the tax credit system. What does that look like? If we have ongoing money, can we have, instead of like capitalized operating subsidy reserves, can we have more of like ongoing annual subsidies to support it and and use that money for that money as real capital money instead? And so I think like that's what's been really cool about the accelerator program and the opportunities it creates, and it's related to the conversations also that people are having around social housing and what does that look like? Because in many ways, what we do is social housing in a different, using these other programs. And if we evolve the system to be outside of the tax credit system, that is fully publicly funded housing. And so what does that look like? And who builds it and who is it for is going to be an interesting part of the conversation. That was not the direction you wanted me to go with that question. But anyway, there you go. Those are my priorities.
That's helpful. I honestly think I learned so much just now. I really appreciate you, Marina. For Western Center, we saw that last year the governor really had committed funding towards housing and homelessness at a scale that we had never seen before. And it looks like this year he has continued, but it's basically been most of the programs that he had began last year. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the ones that we were excited about, which is $100 million for farm worker housing. We know that this is a population across the state that needs a lot of assistance and has their own set of issues. And so really excited to see some set aside money for that population of individuals, which I think are key in California. There was also $100 million for tribal housing. And another piece, which I think I touched on earlier, was related to preserving naturally occurring affordable housing through this CAP program. So it would essentially, it's $500 million to enable mission-driven organizations and to purchase buildings and preserve them as affordable. A $500 million investment really could create up to 4,500 restricted units. I think this is absolutely important and key. Just a couple of budget aspects that really deal with people-centered. So excited to see that the governor is continuing his effort from last year to put his money where his mouth is. So really excited to see that. And then there's one I wanted to highlight, but I think the Assembly member would touch on it if he's able to join us a little bit later. So I'll hold off.
Yeah, hopefully. I want to add to, it's always great that with us we all can highlight each other's stuff. So you guys just checked off half my list for me. I'll highlight primarily one outside of the development ask and the one we're hoping probably Isaac Bryan can cover. And this one deals with our workforce, right? When we talk about homeless services and the affordable housing industry, we're talking about folks that are in very stressful jobs, particularly when you think about outreach workers that are really on the front lines, and we need to start as an industry thinking about their own self-care, things that they need to be sustainable and not burn out. And so we've been talking to a lot of our partners and hearing about that as we start to scale these programs with so much more resources and so many more expectations. We also need to think about the workforce behind this. And so Housing California has been working with a whole host of partners to advance a request this year to fund some services for workforce development, for self-care, some supplements for nonprofits to really care for their workforce. I believe it's $200 million. I'm probably getting that wrong, but it's around there. And so we're really excited about that because we're finally, as an industry, starting to think about self-care for our employees and people that are really doing this work day in and day out. We need to start thinking about that so we don't see burnout and people that aren't able to be successful themselves in this. But I'll highlight that because you talked about CAP, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. Cool.
Questions? There was a moment earlier I was like, we should stop for questions, and we just kept powering through.
Sorry, just on that last note, could you maybe elaborate a little bit? I got the theme, but I don't understand the action.
So the action on the workforce piece is it's a supplement to the HAP program, which is kind of our state's formula grant program that provides resources for to address homelessness. The eligible uses, I wish I could name off the top of my head, but I'd have to double check with my colleague on that because she's really leading that work. She comes from the workforce field, so I can connect you with her. Other questions?
Well, just on accelerator, I mean, do you have a sense of how much they're talking about the increase?
I don't know. We had a conversation just like a couple weeks ago with the governor's office about it. I can't say there was a real sense of what the scale was. I think they're very, they're excited about the accelerator program. This administration, really likes to have their name on, like the signature thing that they, I guess everyone, right? Every legislator, every governor. So I think they like seeing that we like the accelerator program and that it's a good program. And so I think that will influence how much money will continue to go into the accelerator program. When they funded it, like Chris said, last year, I think a lot of the budget funds, the thought was like, well, this is over a 2-year period. But, as we saw, there's a lot of demand. So I don't have an answer for you.
More on that soon.
Yeah,
hopefully.
yeah. I don't even know. Like I said, we were asking for $5 billion for both as like a combined for MHP and accelerator, or like a rollover provision of accelerator if like there ends up being a 25% test, like to roll into MHP. But the administration was pretty silent on what dollar amount would be appropriate.
Yeah.
Which reminds me that our budget surplus is historic. And when the budget is this full, we run an instance where we could surpass the GAN limit, which is this very wonky budget term, where essentially the legislature at one point decided that if we have too much money, there's a certain amount over what we usually have, that a lot of that money would go towards schools, and it's like an automatic trigger. And so the one thing that doesn't have limits on the GAN limit is infrastructure. So in a way, I think housing and housers have a better opportunity this year to say, look, you have so much money, we're about to trigger the GAN limit, and you have to return the money back to the taxpayer base.
Give it to us instead.
Give it to us instead. Exactly. So there is a little bit of an aspect there where maybe we have an argument this year more so than other years.
Yeah.
Hey.
I have two questions. Last year, there was a budget allocation, I think it was like $50 million for encampment resolution on Caltrans properties. I was wondering if anyone was tracking what was happening with that, if there was plans to put more money in this budget. I'll stop there and then I'll.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a priority of the administration's last year, $50 million last year, and then a tenfold increase to $500 million this year. That program, as you mentioned, is focused on encampments. I think to be frank, I think we have a little bit of concerns with the approach, which, we are really strongly in the housing first realm and want to avoid situations in which further criminalization can happen, and people's lives are impacted in that sense, and we just perpetuate this criminal legal system where we're just criminalizing people and, or just moving them, right? It doesn't solve the problem, it just gets it out of eyesight, which doesn't achieve any results. I think there were kind of two pieces to that, though. So the Encampment Resolution Grant Program was under the newly, at that time it was called the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, and now it is the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. That's a mouthful. And so that program is meant to kind of take a little bit better of an approach than a criminalization approach. It's really looking at trying to think through a strategy that provides rental assistance or services to get people housed. It's only $50 million, which is fairly minimal in terms of scope. And, I think that the first grantees were given money recently, which was an interesting set of folks that got resources that first wave. The tenfold increase, I'm not entirely sure if they're going to make changes to the program this time around. I think what's a little bit concerning on that front is that they had for $50 million, I think it was $127 million in applications, and now we're proposing $500 million. So I'm not sure the need meets that kind of that scale, and so I think we would like to see resources put into a more like housing and services focus as opposed to an encampment focus. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Lindsay. Western Center is a lot of bit concerned about that proposal. I'll also mention shortly, the governor unveiled a plan called Care Court, which would essentially create a new court process for individuals that may be dealing with behavioral health or substance abuse disorders, and would compel them to go to court to get services. And then if they were not able to complete the program or were unsuccessful, that they would then be funneled into conservatorship, and it would create a new presumption that that person could not be assisted, and conservatorship is the only option for them. We're highly concerned about the Care Court proposal, and they have mentioned that this proposal would use funds that were already allocated. So to your point, Lindsay, our concern is that the money that's being used to Caltrans to do encampment sweeps would then be used to identify individuals to essentially put them on a pathway to conservatorship. So there's a lot of, at least from the racial and equity community, really, really high concerns about that component. So thank you for asking that.
Well, we have a new guest. Appreciate Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, a new member who has come in guns blazing with some great bills, and maybe we'll let him speak about some of his priorities this year.
How's everybody doing today? Sorry I'm late. I came from Sac State. It's been a very, very busy day, but I wouldn't miss this for anything. It sounds like y'all have had an incredible conversation. Housing is a human right, and we have to make sure that we protect everybody, and everybody has a right to housing. And so when I think about who falls through the cracks, I think about a whole generation of folks, right? I got sworn in when I was 29 years old. I'm still one of the youngest legislators, so I know what it's like for home ownership for a whole wave of us who haven't had new housing built for 30, 40, 50 years. But I also think about people who are coming home from incarceration and people who have barriers to housing and economic mobility put on them. We have to get everybody who's on the streets off the streets, but it seems like, and it doesn't just seem like, the data bears it out, for every handful of folks we get off the streets, an even bigger handful falls into the streets. And part of that handful, again, is folks coming home from incarceration. And I don't mean folks who got released early, not that we can't have conversations about why that's also important. I mean folks who paid their debt to society, served their time, and are coming home. Mm-hmm. We face 47,000 collateral consequences of a conviction on their ability to re-enter society, and one of those is checking the box on housing and rental applications, still having to have your background run after a conditional offer for employment, and it makes the ability to rent a home or own a home almost impossible. So what we've done with AB 1816, sorry, the numbers escape me sometimes, is we are calling on the state to invest $200 million into a reentry workforce and housing and workforce development program statewide. It's a bill that was initially proposed by one of my colleagues, Assemblymember David Chu. Assemblymember Chu wanted to use the money saved from prison closures and have this go in perpetuity. But we haven't realized the gains from prison closures yet. There's actually no money that's been returned back to the state yet in cost savings, and so what we're asking is for a chunk of the surplus, and a sizable chunk. Not as big as I'd like it to be, not as big as we will need to solve this problem, but large enough to help hundreds and thousands of people, and to evaluate that data and to show that when you get people housing when they come home from incarceration, when you couple that with workforce development opportunities that increase economic inclusion, you reduce recidivism, you reduce people falling into homelessness, and you increase the well-being of all. And you save money, both in the immediate, because it's cheaper to get somebody housing and wraparound workforce development services than it is to deal with chronic homelessness and the constellation of services you would need to deal with that. And it's also cheaper than the $110,000 per person per year we're spending to incarcerate somebody, or $15 billion in the aggregate. So that's a bill I'm really excited about. We've moved it out of the Housing Committee already. Picked up a lot of co-authors along the way, including the chair of Housing, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. I had a meeting with Assemblymember Phil Ting today. I haven't even told y'all that yet.
Preview.
And I am strongly encouraging us to find these dollars. A lot of times reentry money, we think about it through a public safety lens, and we shouldn't, because reentering people back into society is actually public safety, economic opportunity. There's an education pipeline and component that needs to be established. And for this particular bill, we're using a housing frame on purpose. Because if we're going to put $6 billion, $8 billion into housing, finding $200 million for some of our most vulnerable folks should be doable. And the data we use from this pilot is hopefully something we can then use to scale this statewide.
Yeah. Cool. You want to hit on 1685?
So 1685, I really like. Homeless parking tickets?
Yep.
Yeah. Again, I don't know the numbers. When you lose your housing, you sleep in your car. And when you lose your car, you sleep in the sidewalk in a tent, or a shelter, or back and forth. I know this well. I have more siblings who are unhoused than who have ever been to college. I'm one of 12. 9 of us came out of the child welfare system. My older brother, I bought him his car. Wasn't very expensive, but it was a car. And it actually served as his home for a while too. And he eventually lost that car. And that's when he started living in Pershing Square in Los Angeles, and chronic mental illness started to creep up and rise and impact his ability to fully understand and comprehend daily life. You can imagine being kind of ostracized from any normal reflection of your humanity does a lot on your mental health. And so when I was thinking about my first bill package, my colleagues don't think about that often, but this is my first bill package. I knew I wanted to do something to kind of address this issue. So I teamed up with the Los Angeles Services Homeless Authority, LAHSA, and we have authored a bill that would forgive parking tickets for people who are unhoused. I know, doesn't sound revolutionary, could have a huge impact, and is for some reason a lot more controversial than I expected. It's like we would like to continue criminalizing and penalizing poverty because that's done so well for us. We have made a concession that the cap out is $1,500 in parking tickets. It's a lot of parking tickets, $1,500 a year. And so that's a caveat we've made, but we haven't made any others because this is not a benefit that should come with strings. This is not a tool to coerce people into anything. This is a benefit you should have because you need it and we have it. And people losing their vehicles because of parking tickets only exacerbates the problem. The root cause of homelessness is a lack of housing and a lack of economic opportunity and inclusion. So penalizing poverty cannot be the solution. It's also why we started the Select Committee on Poverty and Economic Inclusion. But I will say track this bill very closely. We moved through the Transportation Committee just this week, on Monday, with bipartisan support. I convinced the Republicans this is a good idea. And the way I got them on board is because we spend more money trying to collect parking fees from people who are homeless than we end up collecting. And so it's ineffective government. And I used that reasoning, that common sense, and they jumped on board. My fear with this bill, and I'll let you know more than I should, is that there are some who would like to see it used as a tool to coerce community service or, you know, I had some conversations with some of my colleagues who wanted to add amendments that would require you to be actively getting services, whatever that actually means, and I'm really weary of that because you can't compel care, right? And it's not really a benefit if you've got to jump through 3 or 4 hoops to use it. And then it goes underutilized. And then people just continue to struggle. And so I would like to keep this bill to be one that anyone who needs it, who's unhoused, who has parking tickets, qualifies. And then from there, we can continue to build out the larger structures that we'll need to solve this crisis. But those are 2 bills I've got this year. I could use all kinds of support. Housing California is all on top of it. They've made it through the first step in committees, but track it closely. And all of your voices, those of you who are here and people who care, can make all the difference as we move through the process.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize, it's so refreshing to hear a member talk about like really the housing first model, right? Like housing is the foundation and we can't coerce people into treatment. That's not it's not successful. We see poor results when we force treatment and we make treatment a condition or housing a condition of treatment, right? So like if, just having that North Star, it's really good to hear that. So appreciate that. Should we go back to our first question and see if he wants to add to that, or maybe we let the audience? What do you
Well,
guys think?
I want to ask, okay, you were sworn in the fall.
Yeah.
This is your first session.
I call it my second session because, well, one, it makes me sound more senior to my colleagues. But two, I was sworn in during House of Origin. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the legislative cycle, that's the last 2 weeks where every bill that started in the Assembly has to leave the Assembly and go to the Senate, and everyone that started in the Senate has to leave and go to the Assembly. So today we swore in Lori Frazier, and she was sworn in. She came back to her desk, and then all of her friends and family, they went to lunch somewhere. She's gonna go home or come back tomorrow for session or stay up here for session. I came from the dais and voted on 80 bills immediately with no staff. So it was trial by fire. So I call this my second session.
Second session. What do you think?
I have a lot of hope.
Yeah?
I have a lot of hope, a lot of optimism for a couple of reasons. One, the whole body's about to change over. Right? All of a sudden, I really am the veteran next year. The speaker's going to turn out. I sit next to Mark Stone. He's leaving. I'm very sad about that. There's a lot of folks leaving, and that's a lot of opportunity to get new people into office. People with the Housing First vision, people with the radical vision for change, people who have the same hope and naive optimism that I have. But I've also seen enough to know that you need to be very good to get things done. You need to, if you're progressive, you need moderate friends. You need Republican allies. If you're anywhere else on that spectrum, you need progressive friends. You need progressive if you want to get things done. And how do you build those relationships and that allyship without compromising your core values is the trick of the game. And it's something I'm actively practicing and learning and refining. And I think I'm doing a decent job. And the biggest thing that I never want to fall into is the cynicism that seems to build up over some of the longer careers. And it seems to fall into pettiness and, what I've heard is an author problem, where I don't want to support that just because of who it is, right? And that is never going to be me. I could disagree with you all the time, and you can be harmful for all the things I care about. But if you introduce a bill that's not, I'm going to support it, right? And that's what I think this job calls on you to do. So I'm still naively optimistic and hopeful, but you should check in with me annually and see how
And what has been sort of most surprising or caught you most off guard or disappointing from this new experience?
I guess what's caught me most off guard is how many folks don't do all their homework, right? And how commonplace it is to lean on your staff to the point that you never meet with sponsors of bills. You don't think of your own ideas either. It's kind of, there's a formula, and you can just follow the formula. And I'm like a data head and a policy wonk, and I want in the weeds. And my favorite bills this year are ideas I brought and then went and found sponsors for. This bill of David Chu's, I saw that it had died, and I brought it back to life and called Housing California, called the coalition, said, hey, we're coming back to life. We've got to do this year. And so I think that kind of belief in change is not as prevalent amongst all of my colleagues as I wish it was. There's also just some standard norms in the building. As a young legislator, I open the door for people, and you can walk through it. You don't have to take my place and hold it for me, right? Treating other people with dignity and respect is not just something that the legislators should enjoy, but something that everyone who works in and around the building or just walking by on the street should also feel. I've navigated leadership in a thoughtful way. I had some early challenges with everyone votes yes on the budget is a Democrat ideal in the Assembly because we're going to pass a budget, but what happens when you have a trailer bill for $500 million in new corrections spending? I didn't vote for it, by the way. I got a pass, but had to navigate that. I was the only one because you have to vote yes or you could lose your office, your committees, and other things. And so navigating some of those structures, but in every challenge that has been frustrating, I've found kind of hope and optimism too, and learned lessons to help me navigate it better in the future and also show new folks who come into the legislature how to not fall into it.
I'm wondering if you could speak to, you did a lot of work in LA and like Measure J and folks, things like that. But I'm wondering if there's something, like you just got started, you got hopefully many years ahead of you. Is there something you have like aspirationally that you want to achieve, like some big idea or something just generally you want to accomplish and be known for when you finish your time in the legislature?
I don't think there's one policy that's like, and somebody on my team said, well, what's going to be our legacy? And it's like, I'm just trying to do a good job every single day, and I'll let the people decide what the legacy is when it's over. I'd like to have, I told my first year I had one bill, which was a housing bill on purpose. But everything I spoke on and everything I fought for were things that I believed in. They weren't actually my bills. There was no personal ownership. I just got up because it's important that this bill move. And so that was incredibly powerful. But I also saw a lot of bills that got like 75 votes. There's 80 members. And I remember telling Mark Stone, my seatmate, I never want to run a bill that gets 75 votes. Because it probably doesn't do anything. or there would be at least a little pushback from somebody somewhere if it was big enough to make a difference. So I would like to have a career of bills that get 45 to 50 that I had to work for that all make a measurable difference in the lives of people.
It's a great goal. Awesome. Well, I think we'll finish here. I want to thank the assembly member. I know you had a busy schedule today and for cutting the time out and all your leadership and pushing these really progressive bills forward. So we will finish here, and thanks everyone for coming.
you.
Appreciate you all.